What's up everyone, welcome to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Edward Lee. I'm a filmmaker and photographer, and if you clicked on this video, it's because you're interested in potentially purchasing the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 6K or the 4K. Now I've owned both of these cameras for about a year now, and I've been wanting to make this video for a while, but I feel like now is a good time to kind of give you my thoughts on what I think about both of these cameras and which one I think is the right one for you. So let's not waste any time and get right into it. So in this video, I'll be sharing with you guys what I love about the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera, just both of these guys, what I love about them. I'll also be sharing with you some of my dislikes that I have for these cameras, and also who I think the Pocket 4K is for and who the 6K is for. Now, if you're only interested in part of what I just said, I'll put timestamps down below, but I do think it'll be helpful to watch the entire video if you're interested in getting either of these, or if it's your first Pocket Cinema camera. Now, the first thing I love about these cameras is their ability to shoot a RAW codec, or more specifically, their Blackmagic RAW. And for me personally, I don't really shoot in RAW or need to use the capabilities of it. I've basically never had to actually tap into the RAW capabilities of the B-RAW codec. I don't really think it fits my workflow. I always try to get my desired image as close as I can in camera when I'm actually shooting it, and I try not to rely too much on the RAW capabilities. But if that's important to you and you want to be able to have that flexibility and manipulate your video files in post, the fact that it shoots in B-RAW is a huge plus if that's what you're looking for. The second thing I love about these cameras is just the ease of use. If you've met anyone who's used any of these cameras, they'll probably say the same thing. Just the way they designed the menu and the fact that it's a huge touchscreen. I don't know how else to explain it besides the fact that it's really intuitive. The feedback, there's no lag, it's really quick, and you won't have any problems with the learning curve in terms of how to actually change the settings of the cameras. I've never had any real problems with the display, and for me that's a plus because nothing's worse than kind of an old school or laggy touchscreen system that's not that intuitive. They did a really good job at making it an enjoyable process to actually use the LCD to its full capacity. The next thing I love about these cameras is their dual native ISO. I won't get too technical about this, and I'm not an expert with all the tech features on these cameras. I just know that there's two ISOs built into these cameras that kind of reset the noise levels. So at 400 ISO, that's their first base, I believe. And at that ISO, it's prioritizing the highlights. So if getting details in the highlights is important to you, you shoot at the native ISO if you can. But the great thing is once you increase your ISO number and you get to 1250, it actually resets. And so there's now no more noise and it resets at 1250. The only downside to that is now it's prioritizing more of the shadows and less of the highlights. So your highlights might be a little bit more blown out. But for me personally, for example, when I shoot real estate videos, it's actually helpful because I don't want to see what's through the windows. And so shooting at 1250 is nice because you could have more light come in and you could prioritize more of the shadows and have less noise. So being able to have two native ISOs is really handy versus just having one and then having more noise as you increase the ISO levels. Another thing I love about this camera is just the overall image quality that comes out of this camera. So before I actually got the 4K, I've tried everything from a Sony a7S II, a7 III, 5D Mark IV, EOS R, kind of tried the whole mirrorless DSLR video thing. And the 4K was kind of my first go at a more cinema level camera. And let me tell you, the image quality that comes out of these cameras is amazing. Coming from shooting on 8-bit codec with the a7 III or a EOS R, you will have such a fun time color grading and shooting on this B-RAW footage. It's just amazing. I don't know how else to explain it. I'll try to lay over some footage that I got with these cameras, but I really feel like with these cameras straight out of the box, you could slap a lens on it and you can get beautiful images that I feel like cannot be replicated with a lot of the mirrorless systems that we see today. The last thing I want to mention when it comes to what I love about the cameras is the fact that there's so much third-party accessories for both of these cameras. As you guys can see, I have the Tilta cage on here. It's a full cage for the camera system, and Tilta also makes a ton of accessories as far as battery solutions, grips, handles, kind of the whole 9 yards. And there's other companies like Small Rig who also make more cheaper and affordable rig systems for both of these cameras. So if you're looking to build out your camera into like a full-on rig, there's so much support for that for both of these cameras, and that is a big plus for me. Now, there's probably so many other things that I can keep going on about in terms of what I love about the cameras, but let's move on to some of the things that I don't like about the cameras, even though there's not that many. But first things first, the battery life on these cameras is trash. Like literally, you need battery solutions. The Canon LPE6 batteries that it natively takes, just one battery, it will die in probably like 20 minutes or so if you're using the camera and you're trying to record with it. So the battery life I feel like that's a huge downside if you're trying to just film with just the camera without battery solutions. But to be honest, for me, it's not a huge issue because like I said, there's so many third-party accessories that are supporting these cameras now, and you can find battery solutions that can help you shoot for hours or even the full day. The next kind of downside about this camera, in my opinion, in terms of the running gun style, is the fact that even though the LCD and the menu and the touchscreen is all great, super intuitive, I wish it was a flip out screen or at least tilted, because of the kind of form factor of the camera, it's tough to kind of get low angles or high angles with the LCD just being built flat onto the body. So that's kind of a downside, but an easy fix for that is basically using a monitor or external monitor, which I use pretty much every single time when I use either of these cameras. So it's a downside if you don't have a monitor, but it's not the end of the world. Tilta actually makes a custom accessory kit where you can actually turn your LCD into a tilt screen, but I feel like at that point when you're spending that much money to make it a tilt screen, you might already be going over budget, and getting something else might be more worth it. And the last thing you might not like about the camera, or I've seen a lot of people online talk about, is just the awkward form factor of the body. We see a lot of like cube brain style cameras coming out lately with just like the sensor in it. And then you also see like the mirrorless DSLR cameras that have ergonomically just like better grips and whatnot. And this camera doesn't really fall into either of those categories. It does feel a little bit weird and chunky, especially when you have bigger lens on the 6K. Just the weight distribution is a little awkward, but for me personally, I haven't had any problems with it. I still think it's a great camera ergonomically speaking, like where the buttons are placed and the record button. I never had any problems with it, but if ergonomics is a really big deal for you and having it feel super solid in the hand, that is something to consider when thinking about either of these cameras. Now, transitioning a bit, let's go into the main differences between these two cameras. Now, the first main difference between these two cameras obviously is within the name. This shoots at a 6K resolution. This shoots at a 4K resolution. You can shoot less than that, but that's kind of the max resolution that you can shoot out of both of these cameras. This has a Super 35 sensor, and this has a Micro Four Thirds sensor. Now that goes into the next main difference, which is the lens compatibility or the mount. This is a Canon EF mount, so if you have a lot of Canon lenses, it will go straight onto here without an adapter. But for this camera, it's a Micro Four Thirds mount. So if you come from like a GH5 or a Panasonic system with a lot of Lumix or Panasonic lenses, they'll go straight onto this camera without an adapter. But if you have Canon lenses, you're gonna need an adapter if you wanna use it on the 4K. And the last difference that I think is important to consider when thinking about both of these cameras is the price. Obviously, the 4K is cheaper than the 6K. I think at the time of this video, the BMPCC 4K is $1,300 and the 6K is $2,000. Now, keep in mind though, when it comes to price, the 4K, yeah, it's a lot cheaper, but if you have Canon lenses and you're looking to adapt them onto here, you're gonna need an adapter. And I recommend the MetaBones adapter, and that costs around $500 or $600. So when you take that into consideration, if you're planning to get the adapter with the 4K, you might be better off just getting the 6K. So that's definitely something to consider if you're in the market for either of these. All right, at this point, I've shared with you what I love about the BMPCC camera system and some of my little dislikes that I have about the cameras. But now let's talk about, if you who's watching this on the other side of this screen, who is this camera for? Like, should you get the 4K? Should you get the 6K? Let me share with you who I think the 4K is for and who I think should get the 6K. I think that if you prioritize portability and you want to keep a small footprint, you do a lot of like handheld work, and you want to have a smaller lens system on your camera, I think the 4K is a great fit. I also think the 4K is more than enough camera if you're coming from shooting or exporting in 1080. Like if you're coming from Sony or Canon or Nikon and you're traditionally used to shoot in like a 1080 format, the 4K resolution is gonna be more than enough for you, and I highly would recommend getting the Pocket 4K. I also think the 4K is a great fit if you don't already have a ton of Canon glass or Canon lenses. If you are coming from a Panasonic system like the GH5, that's even better because you can actually those lenses will go straight onto this camera. Overall though, I think the 4K is a really solid camera if you're transitioning from kind of a mirrorless system like a Canon EOS R, Sony a7 III. If you're trying to coming from that world, I think the 4K is a huge step up from that. And really for the price at $1,300, in my opinion, I don't think you can beat that right now in terms of, even though there's a ton of cameras that have come out this past year, I still think for $1,300, for the amount of quality you'll get out of the images that this camera produces, I don't think you really can be beat. So if you're trying to, have really high quality videos on a budget and kind of get your foot in the door with, in terms of the cinema world, I think this is a great camera. Now, who do I think the Blackmagic Pocket 6K is for? I think the 6K is a solid camera for one, if you need that extra resolution. Like if you already shoot in 4K, that's great. And the 6K will even be better because you have more playroom in post-production, especially if you export in 4K as well. So if resolution is a big deal to you, definitely the 6K. Although I don't really think 6K is necessary. It's kind of overkill with how much resolution, how much importance is put on resolutions lately, but the 6K, having it is definitely a nice touch. But the next most important thing is if you already shoot maybe Canon for photography, or you have a lot of Canon lenses, it's kind of a no-brainer to go with the 6K because you don't have to get any adapters and they'll work natively with the mount. And so if you have a ton of Canon glass, I would recommend getting the 6K. I also feel like with the 6K resolution, you kind of future-proof your camera a little bit more than the 4K because obviously not all cameras have adopted kind of the 6K as the standard. So the fact that this is a 6K resolution, it'll kind of be relevant, in my opinion, for a longer period. Now, one little downside about the 6K though, when it comes to resolution, is that let's say you're on a project and you don't really need the 6K because 6K files are honestly larger than 4K files. So let's say you want to shoot 4K on this camera, it has a crop on the sensor, so you can't shoot full sensor at 4K. You're gonna have to deal with a little bit of a crop. There actually have been a lot of times where I actually don't need all the 6K resolution. I don't want to deal with bigger file sizes, so I actually opt to use the 4K. It actually happens quite often. So that's a huge thing to consider too, is just storage. When you shoot at the 6K resolution, there will be bigger file sizes. So if you're not interested or keen on getting more storage or hardware for your footage, that's something to consider too, because yeah, 6K, bigger file sizes. Another thing I love about the 6K and who I think it might be for is if you're in a one-man band or it's just yourself shooting. Like I'm a freelance videographer and I shoot a lot of the projects myself. Having the 6K resolution is nice because you can actually pull screen grabs. I think like 22 megapixel screen grabs from the 6K video footage. And honestly, like when I work with clients, I'm able to pull stills from the video and deliver them as a whole separate part of the project, like still images from the video that I edit, that I pull screen grabs from on the 6K camera. So if you pull screen grabs often from your video clips, or you like having them as photos, definitely the 6K, because the screen grabs look way more crispy than the 4K. So at the end of the day, both of these cameras are amazing, and in reality, it's really about the story, and lighting is like the most important thing. Either of these cameras will do perfectly fine in any condition with a good location, good lighting, and a good story. And I know that sounds cliche, but these features, apart from what you're learning in this video, it doesn't really matter. It's really what's in the actual frame in front of the camera that will help your videos be elevated, not 6K or 4K or Canon mount or Micro Four Thirds mount. So I hope you found this video helpful if you're in the market for either of these cameras. I just want you guys also to know that I'm not biased in either of these cameras. I'm not just a fanboy about these cameras because I use them. I actually use Canon systems regularly, like the C70 I recently got testing out, and I use the R5. So I truly am a fan of the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera. I think for the price, it cannot be beat right now, especially with so many cameras coming out, but they're also super expensive. So if you're trying to, become a filmmaker, or you're trying to up your video quality on a budget, this is really, you can't go wrong with either of these cameras. If you have any questions at all, make sure to drop them down below. I'll try to answer all of them if I didn't cover the topic in this video already. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. I'm gonna be coming out with way more videos this upcoming year. I don't exactly know what of yet, but I just want to create more videos and bring more value to you guys. So hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications if you don't want to miss any of them. But other than that, I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.